Tonight on Talking Politics, tension is building between the Massachusetts House and Senate over changes that could give the House some extra sway on policymaking. I'll be talking with State Senator Mike Barrett about why he thinks the changes are a bad idea. But first, there's a renewed push to halt all new prison construction in the state. The legislature passed a moratorium last year, but it was vetoed by then Governor Charlie Baker, whose administration was moving to build a new women's prison to replace MCI-Framingham. Now, with a new administration in charge, lawmakers and advocates are bringing the bill back and urging the state to also take care of the women who are currently at MCI-Framingham. I'm joined now by three of those advocates: Elizabeth Matos, the Executive Director of Prisoners Legal Services of Massachusetts; Mallory Hanora, the Executive Director of Families for Justice as Healing; and Angelia Jefferson, who was incarcerated at MCI-Framingham for 31 years and now works with Families for Justice as Healing as well. Thank you all for being here. Liz, when former Governor Baker vetoed this proposed moratorium last year, he argued that he wasn't looking to expand the state's prison capacity, but that he needed to be able to make the system work efficiently, needed to be able to improve conditions in the system. How close did the legislature come to overriding that veto? Was that ever in the realm of possibility?
I think it was in the realm of possibilities, but it didn't happen. It was so late in the session that it made it difficult to get it passed. There were efforts, a lot of organizing, especially by Families for Justice Healing, that we supported to get a special session called so that that could still happen, but ultimately was not successful. And so we're very hopeful that this is the year it gets passed.
And I should mention just procedurally, one reason that we're all talking here today, I've been interested in this issue for a little while along with others, but there's going to be a hearing next week, right, on Beacon Hill, and you're going to be rallying at the State House to try to build support for the moratorium. Mallory, as your T-shirt testifies to, very good branding on your part, your organization just doesn't only want to put a moratorium on new prison construction in Massachusetts, but you want to decarcerate women and girls. You want to end the incarceration of that population. Can you give me a primer on why you believe that's the right thing to do policy-wise?
Sure. So Families for Justice as Healing was founded by Andrea James and the women that she was incarcerated with inside of federal prison. So our organizing started inside of prison by women who were living through the experience themselves. The conditions of being incarcerated, the separation from their families, the isolation and the deprivation, and women who also had a brilliant vision for what else was possible. And so we've continued that organizing, brought it home here to Massachusetts, and sisters have gone on to found the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, and all of us share this audacious mission of ending the incarceration of women and girls because we know that incarceration only causes further harm and trauma, and it doesn't address the issues that folks are facing in their own community, right? So we need something different. It is possible to have a different way forward, and incarceration is not it. And here in Massachusetts, we have a low incarcerated population. This is an opportunity.
Lowest rate of any state in the country, right?
That's right. And this is an opportunity for us to actually be a model and create what's different looks like and move beyond what we know isn't working, what we know isn't stopping harm from happening, what we know isn't meeting people's needs, and shift those resources into what's going to help women and our children and families thrive.
So before I get to you, Angelia, and hear about your story and your experience at MCI-Framingham, can you just describe for me briefly, what would you like to see happen if a woman commits a serious crime? Instead of her being incarcerated for a few decades or more, what should happen? And I'm dealing in a big sort of vague hypothetical here because I don't want to get into particulars, but a serious crime. What should happen instead of incarceration?
Right. First, I want to say, what does investment look like in addressing the root causes of harm, right? So that we're actually thinking about prevention and making sure what people need, they have what they need in the first place. And then when harm does continue to happen, we know that police, prosecutors, and prisons are not stopping those cycles. And in many cases, they're actually fueling them and making it more difficult for people to live in community. So for us, we think about transformative justice approach, addressing the hurt between people, the harm between people, the cycles of conflict, also meeting people's basic needs so that they have what they need to live well, to treat each other well, to take care of their families. All of that is a better approach than what we're doing now. And also I want to talk about real accountability, right? Real accountability isn't happening in settings of incarceration right now. You're sent away, you're isolated, you're deprived of what you need. Very often you're continuing to experience harm yourself, and that's not about personal responsibility, that's just about punishment. So what does real accountability look like? Taking responsibility for our actions, having what we need to be good to ourselves and other people, that's really what we're talking about.
Angelia, we just heard Mallory talk about the experience of being incarcerated for women, for example, women at MCI-Framingham, but I really want to hear what it was like for you. You spent a little more than 3 decades there after you were convicted of murder. What was that 3-decade experience like? And what was it like, among other things, to raise a family while you were incarcerated?
Well, it wasn't easy, first of all. On a daily basis, my biggest thing was that I had to educate myself so I can know what was going on with myself, let alone what was going on in the world around me, my new community that I was in at that moment. Trying to navigate through the prison and do everything that I had to do for myself, but at the same time raise my 3 children, because I had 3 children, raise them plus my siblings, who I was also raising before I went to prison. It wasn't easy, but I had to do it. That's why I chose to do my time and not allow my time to do me. I chose to get involved in education. I dropped out of school when I was 16 years old after I had my first child. I chose to get involved in education and educate myself. I went on to get my GED, where I then earned my bachelor's degree that I have now. I have my cosmetology license. I train 12 dogs. I am a certified restorative justice keeper. I am a peer supporter. You name it. I did every group, every program that they had in the prison. I wasn't going to let what I did hold me back. I felt like I had to rebuild myself because I wasn't in a good place when I entered. And I had to rebuild myself to a place where I felt comfortable with myself and comfortable with giving my children and my siblings advice, because they were also going to school. How can I tell them, you all have to stay in school when I dropped out? I want to be a power of example to them and for them.
I want to ask you a version of the same question that I just ran by Mallory. If you were able to design a new criminal justice system, a new approach to crime and punishment in one fell swoop, what would you like to see happen with women who commit crimes like the one that sent you to jail? What do you think the right approach would be rather than incarceration?
There's so many different construction sites going on in the world right now. I was just down in Alabama a couple of weeks ago, and they're building different housing complexes down there also. So for me, I would say take one of those lots that you're building these buildings on and turn that building into a place where the women can go and they can also go out and work. They can get the groups that they need. They can get the mental health that they need. They can get the medical help that they need also. Some type of independent living situation.
So when you describe that, some type of independent living situation in which there is, would it involve some restrictions on mobility, for example, a little less mobility than you'd get in a traditional prison setting? I just want to make sure that I'm thinking this through as clearly as I can.
Okay, yes. Okay. It would, you know, restrict it a little bit, but at the same time, give them the opportunity to rebuild themselves. Everyone needs a chance.
I stopped flipping my cards as I was listening to your story, so bear with me. I got to get up to speed here. Liz, let me go back to you. I want to make sure that I am clear on PLS's mission vis-a-vis their group's mission. Are you also in support of total decarceration of women and girls at PLS?
That should be the goal. We similarly, you know, we focus on prison conditions in our advocacy work and the civil rights and human rights of folks inside. And our many, many years, over 50 years now of work has really demonstrated that what we have primarily is a culture problem in this institution, very much a focus on punishment and a digression over many years from rehabilitation. And rehabilitation, we know, happens best in the community. As Mallory was saying, you know, this is a lot, the root causes of incarceration are things that we can address as a community, as a society. Throwing tens of millions of dollars into a new fancy construction site is not going to change the cultural problems that really lead to the harm that's being done to people who are incarcerated. And the women's population is the smallest, right, in the system. This is an opportunity, as Mallory was saying, to shrink the population with existing mechanisms that are not being fully utilized right now, that exist within the law, to release women who can safely be released, and really establish better pathways to reentry so that people stay out when they get out, because that's an infrastructure that needs the $50 million far more than a new building.
I want to ask each of you to weigh in on an argument that was made by the Boston Globe editorial page when they were saying that the moratorium was a bad idea last year. But I think it's also probably something that some of our viewers are going to be saying to themselves. I think that the Globe tapped into a way of thinking about criminal justice and imprisonment that is not unique to the paper's editorial page. So let's take a look at how the Globe put it. Back in July 2022, in an editorial titled, "Put the Brakes on the Prison Moratorium," the paper wrote, "People will commit crimes, they will be sentenced to prison, and our criminal justice system needs to provide those inmates with better conditions than it does currently. Unless and until we become a community of saints, a 5-year moratorium risks ushering in an area of potentially cruel and unusual punishment." What I hear there is two different ideas. First, we need to be able to improve prison conditions, but also it's appropriate for there to be a measure of punishment if people commit crimes, and they're going to continue to. Mallory, I'd love to hear your response first, and then I'd love to hear from the two of you as well.
Yeah, first of all, the Department of Correction has already been cited for Eighth Amendment violations by the Department of Justice. So it is a cultural problem. The DOC is unwilling and unable to take care of people in DOC custody, and that's been a problem for a very long time. So construction is not going to solve that problem. What we're saying is, yes, the conditions in Framingham are bad, and incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women have been saying that for many more years than we've been fighting for the prison moratorium. Those have not been addressed. So right now, what we need to do is pause and focus on releasing women, bringing women home to the community where they can actually be safe, because they cannot be safe in the Department of Correction. And we actually had a reply to that editorial. Our founder, Angelia Jefferson, had an editorial that said, what we should actually be trying to do is shut down Framingham forever without rebuilding it or replacing it, because we can do something different here.
But I want to get you, and by the way, feel free to hop in. You don't need to wait for me to call in here. What about the idea, and again, I think some of our viewers will be thinking this to themselves right now, what about the idea that, okay, if someone commits a serious crime, yes, it's important to think about ways that they can ultimately reintegrate with society, become productive, help their own families, but at the same time, it's also appropriate to punish that person, that man or woman, because they did something that we view in society as anathema. What would you say to people who might be thinking that to themselves or muttering that to themselves as they watch this interview?
Yeah, I mean, of course, but it's really, that is rooted in historical notions of what punishment gets us. And as Mallory was saying, it's really, what people really want is accountability. Taking accountability should not be equated with punishment, because they're actually two totally different things. You can be punished for a decade or 2 decades, but never actually engage in a process of accountability or kind of restoring or repairing a relationship with the quote-unquote victim's family, right? And this is an issue that is global, right? There are many countries that engage in different processes around atrocities that happen. There are truth and reconciliation commissions. There are all kinds of processes around repairing relationships when harm is done that don't amount to punishment. So I think challenging the notion of punishment and seeing what is that actually resulting in terms of public safety is really important. And the other piece that I would say is that what people really want, like the punishment is something we kind of revert to. But even with our own children, right, what we're teaching, what we give them when we give them consequences is partly conditioning and partly accountability, right? Like, we want you to understand this wasn't okay. But the consequences are only until there's an understanding. So when someone's incarcerated, just throwing them in a cell is not doing anything to actually, we know statistically, we're not preventing crime by placing people in prisons and jails. That is a very clear statistic that already exists. It's not a deterrent.
Before I get your take here, Angelia, I want to just check on something. You said the quote-unquote victim. At one point, do you take issue with the idea that there are victims in certain cases?
No, I mean, there are victims for sure. I think there are plenty of people who are actually not guilty of the crime they were convicted of, incarcerated as well. And that's something that has, I think, had more light shed on it as people have challenged that through innocence projects and things like that. But the other side is that not everyone perceives themselves as a victim, right? There are many families who understand that what is happening is a result of just systemic oppression and see themselves as part of resolving the problem and not necessarily a dichotomy of victim and perpetrator. So I was also challenging that and just respecting that there are people who others would consider victims who don't necessarily want to be called a victim.
Angelia, what's your take on the Globe's objections? Basically, people are going to commit crimes and the conditions need to be improved while they're doing time for the crimes.
I think it all starts with the communities. You know, if there was better jobs, if there was better health care, if there was better mental health, if there were better things for the communities, the community that I come from, if there were better things for the black and brown people in my community, I think a lot of the crimes wouldn't happen. But with the crimes that has happened, I still do not think that prison is the way. I still, once again, independent living. Independent living.
We have an approach called reimagining communities with the National Council, and that is because we're not reimagining prisons anymore. They've been called reformatories and correctional centers, and now trauma-informed prisons, gender-responsive prisons.
And a threat I'm hearing from the two of you is that they can't be reformed.
A prison is a prison is a prison. And, you know, MCI-Framingham was built 150 years ago. Shame on us if we can, the only answer that we can come up with what to do with women 150 years later is just another prison. Closing question,
we got very philosophical there, which I think is important to do because you're steeped in this work, but it's a new way of thinking to a lot of people, and I think there's value in talking it through. What are the political prospects for the moratorium that you have been working for this year? Is there as much momentum in the legislature, and is Governor Reilly on board with the idea?
It's a critical moment, and we feel like community members set a mandate last year. That's how we got a bill to a governor's desk in a single session. We're knocking doors, we're making phone calls, and there's wide agreement that we need a prison moratorium. So we're definitely going to let the legislature know that this is what the people want. We want something different. We believe it's a good opportunity at this hearing to raise a sense of urgency because we know that the executive branch of our state is currently meeting with architects about the new women's prison.
And that's gone on through the first months of the Reilly administration, right? Okay. Do you have anything to add there?
Well, I think it remains to be seen where the Reilly administration is at on this, but I think it's notable that the current budget does not include a huge increase for building and that there's hopefully some very serious consideration happening of what this would get us. I have business owners and firm lawyers asking me, but why would we spend this much money on a new prison now? So I think there are some really practical questions to be asking and also to be challenging the notion that a trauma-informed, gender-affirming, whatever prison is going to change things. We should be caring about impact and results and not making huge moves like this where we don't know what the outcome's going to be.
I got to wrap it here because otherwise I won't be giving our next guest any chance to speak. I wish we had another hour to talk about this though because it's very complicated, very interesting, and very important. Angelia, Mallory, and Liz, thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Next up, the two branches of the state legislature have always had a complicated relationship. When it comes to lawmaking, the Massachusetts House and Senate are partners and part of a collective whole that acts as a counterweight to the governor. But they're also rivals who frequently have very different ideas about policymaking. Now that tension is coming to the fore thanks to a public spat between the two chairs of the Joint Committee on Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy, which right now isn't really operating as a joint committee in the traditional sense of the phrase. And if the disagreement spreads, it could have big implications for the legislature as a whole. I'm joined now by one of the principals, State Senator Mike Barrett, who is the Senate co-chair of the committee in question. Senator, thank you for being here. Can you start by giving me and our viewers a layperson-friendly description of what's going on with your committee right now.
Yeah. Well, imagine a two-family home, a two-family house. The family occupying one half has 2 kids, and the family occupying the other half has no kids. And the issue is who's going to mow the lawn. You can do it one of 2 ways, I guess. You could give each family an equal say and require agreement, which is the way it's traditionally been done and the way the Senate would like to see it continue. Or you can decide that overall majority votes will determine who mows the lawn. In that case, the family with 2 kids would always win. That's really what this is about. In the two-family situation, the House and the Senate, do both get an equal voice, or do we switch to a majority, in which case one side always prevails?
Now, tell me if I've got this right. By the way, thank you for that. It's evocative, and I can wrap my brain around it, but I still want to make sure that we hammer out the details. So your counterpart, your House counterpart, Representative Jeff Roy, wants, tell me if I am getting this correct, he wants to let the majority decide not just when hearings are scheduled, but when the votes on bills are taken. Correct? And you
That's right.
do, it's the latter proposition that that they would be able to decide, or that a majority vote would decide when votes are taken, that you're especially taking issue with. Have I got that right?
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, but the interesting question, if you want to take a half step back, is what is a joint committee and how do these joint committees work?
Thank you.
I can tell you that across the United States, the House in different states has one set of hearings, and the Senate in different states has another set of hearings, and then there's a conference committee to reconcile differences. We're almost unique. The Joint Committee puts senators and House members in the same room at the same time to hear witnesses and to make decisions. But here's the math. There are 160 members of the House. There are 40 members of the Senate. So simple majority rule, in my example, the family with 2 kids, would always win. And simple majority rule in the Massachusetts legislature, if we ever were to go to that system as the House now proposes, the House would always prevail. We want the tried and true method to be used, which is to say each branch gets an equal voice, which requires that we reach consensus. That's the way it's always happened. We produced 2 landmark climate bills in 2021 and 2022 with this requirement of consensus, and I personally hope that we can return to that.
And you want that equal voice to be, again, when it comes to when votes are scheduled, right? Because ultimately, when the vote happens, the House is still going to outnumber the Senate, correct?
Well, you know, now we're getting into the weeds a little. Here's something that you could do, and it is done in the rules. You could require that a majority of the House members and a majority of the Senate members both agree. So simple majorities don't necessarily override the requirement of consensus in every case, but I'm getting too detailed.
And that would be a new way of doing it, right? That would be a new framework?
Well, actually, no, that is also used some in the current situation at times. But the key is, right now, it's consensus. Both sides have to agree. If we do go to simple majorities at all key moments, including deciding when to vote, then basically the House will always win. Now, the House has many good ideas on climate policy, the area that I focus on, but my Senate colleagues have a lot of good ideas too. Requiring the House and the Senate to agree on a final product is pretty constructive. Changing the rules of the game and going to simple majorities in every case would be the equivalent of half of a two-family house always deciding who's going to mow the grass.
I want to read from a statement that we got from your counterpart, the House co-chair Jeff Roy. We asked him to be here for this discussion. He was not able to make it, but he did send us a statement which read in part, the discussion around committee rules should not prevent our committee from holding joint hearings on critical legislation. I strongly support committee rules that allow either chair to propose action on legislation, thereby preventing one chair from maintaining absolute control over which bills advance from committee and restoring the influence of each individual committee member in the legislative process. Two things I want to point out there. You just held a committee hearing that was separate from the House on, if I understand it correctly, among other things, legislation involving the siting of electrical charging stations for cars this past week. So the same set of experts spoke to you and your Senate colleagues, and then at a different time they spoke to Jeff Roy and his House colleagues. It sounds to me in that statement like the House co-chair is accusing you of, either in practice or in intent, exercising undue influence by taking your role as one of the two co-chairs and saying, no, we're not going to move ahead with this legislation. What's your response?
Well, it's called negotiating. Let's go back to my example. If each family in a two-family house has the ability to say, no, I don't want to mow the lawn that way, what has to then happen to reconcile differences is a negotiation. Both parties have equal say. If you really reverse engineer my friend's statement there, what he's really saying is he wants to take away the Senate's ability to insist on a negotiated outcome. He doesn't want one branch to be able to say, our ideas aren't being given equal sway here, let's continue the conversation. What Jeff is saying instead is, gee, I would like to always win. I never want these folks able to say, well, wait a second, I have the majority. There are 160 members in the Massachusetts House, only 40 senators. I want my majority to always prevail. I don't like it when these guys insist on an equal say.
You've been very public with your disagreement with the approach that Representative Roy wants to take. Is this same dynamic playing out in other joint committees right now?
Well, yes, because this is sometimes misconstrued as an argument between Jeff and I. I like Jeff. He and I are friends. We actually go back a ways, and we managed to negotiate a landmark climate bill just 12 months ago. What's new here is coming from above Jeff's head. The House handed out new rules that for the very first time destroy this two-family arrangement that I've described and instead would have simple majorities overriding in every joint committee. What's different is that Jeff is a very capable lawyer. He's a very smart person. He's a very competent person. He's decided to take this new House idea of simple majority rule to the extreme, to the max. And I'm simply saying, let's go with what's worked in the past. Let's make sure the Senate, even though we're outnumbered, has an equal say.
You've only got 15 seconds here. Are we going to hear more Senate co-chairs speaking out the way that you've been speaking out the past few weeks?
Many of them have been supportive. I think I'm the canary in the coal mine, and if that's the way it has to be, I'm comfortable with that.
All right, State Senator Mike Barrett, thank you for being here and explaining this.
Thank you very much.
That's it for tonight, but do come back next week. And please, as always, tell us what you think. The email's talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics. And you can find me on Twitter. I'm @ReillyAdam. For now, thank you for watching, and good night.